which really brings us into our next topic. Perfect, where we get to talk about the Philippine Human Rights Act and what are the local efforts to push this forward. And so on this slide, we see a group photo capturing how the Portland Human Rights Commission voted in favor of a resolution to suspend military aid to the Duterte regime. And so this photo was taken in January of this year. And if we move to the next slide, you'll get to see an excerpt of the letter that the Portland Human Rights Commission wrote, urging the federal government to suspend United States, sorry, having a little trouble with my screen. But where the Human Rights Commission of Portland urged our federal government to suspend the United States security assistance with the Philippines until such a time as human rights violations by Philippine security forces cease and the responsible state forces are held accountable. And so you can learn more about this resolution and just connect with the local legislative steering committee. But we'll go ahead and kind of run through the other things that have been happening just in this year alone. And so if we'll move to the next slide. And so on this slide, you get to see the local support that we've gained from both Representative Blumenauer as well as Bonamici, who both signed and supported Representative Jan Schakowsky's letter that spoke out and condemned the anti-terror law that had been passed in July 2020. And then if we move to the next slide. So in September, moving from July to September, in that time, we were able to get Representative Susan Wild to introduce HR 8313, more commonly known as the Philippine Human Rights Act. And so we'd like to share a short clip with you all. We can play the video.
Rodrigo Duterte's brutal regime is using the pretext of a so-called anti-terrorism law to ramp up efforts targeting labor organizers, workers, and political opponents. In response to these abuses, I introduced the Philippine Human Rights Act, which would block U.S. funding for police or military assistance to the Philippines, outlining a series of basic criteria which would have to be met in order to resume such funding. Let us stand with the people of the Philippines.
And so after Representative Wild introduced the Philippine Human Rights Act, we saw dozens of representatives signing on to sponsor, including Representative Bonamici. Next slide, please. And so now we will hear from members of the local legislative steering committee and why they're involved and support the passing of the Philippine Human Rights Act. Our first speaker is Sofia Vicencio. Sophia is 27, born in Illinois, moved to Portland in 2013, is a member of Gabriela Portland, BAYANI Portland, and the local legislative team. Sophia's papa moved from Manila to Illinois on a Fulbright scholarship in the 80s. And Sophia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Malaya Movement and for funds for having me. My name is Sophia. Thank you for the introduction. So yeah, I am on the steering committee for the local legislative work in Portland. We are pushing for the Philippine Human Rights Act to be introduced in the Senate side in Oregon with our Oregon senators. But I'm also a member of Gabriela Portland, and Gabriela is we are the center of the militant women's movement struggling for national sovereignty, democracy, and the full liberation of women. But there are more than 200 organizations, so more than 200 of us, institutions, desks, and programs of women all over the Philippines seeking to build a mass movement, recognizing the three root problems of the Philippines and address the rights and welfare of Filipino women through education, organizing, campaigns, and cultural work. This movement primarily relies on the foundational backbone of women's mass movement, and it also recognizes the participation of the toiling women as significant to advance the militant democratic and patriotic movement of women throughout the archipelago. So that is Gabriela, and there are many reasons why we are so adamant about supporting the Philippine Human Rights Act, specifically for reasons of wanting to suspend U.S. security assistance to the Philippines until all of these human rights violations by Philippine security officials cease and the responsible state forces are held accountable. You know, like Tabs was saying, this is something we cannot ignore. This is something we cannot leave the Filipinos behind. And so this is our way of it's another way of addressing the system and addressing the conflict with the U.S. government and Filipinos who are trying to exist out here. So, and I can also name a few different examples of this as well. Earlier in the last 5 years, I don't remember the exact year, but there was a woman known as Jennifer Laude, and she was killed by a U.S. soldier, Joseph Scott Pemberton, and Pemberton is walking free in the States. He was actually pardoned by Duterte earlier in this fall. I believe it was September. So Gabriela is always fighting for justice for Jennifer Laude. We want her. We want justice for her, as well as the LGBTQ folks in the Philippines and also here. Uh, Earlier this year in June, during Pride Month in the Philippines, the Bahagari group in the Philippines was protesting the Philippine government, protesting against the anti-terror law, which flags anyone who dissents against the Philippine government. Why do I keep saying the U.S.? Protesting against the Philippine government, and they were arrested. There were 20 protesters in June who were arrested in the Philippines for peacefully protesting the government and also the terror bill, which was a bill at the time. They were trying to prevent it from becoming law. Additionally, there are a number of different Filipino women and Filipino human rights activists in the Philippines who are seen as political prisoners. They are political prisoners and they're not safe in the Philippines from their own government. Specifically, one comes to mind, but there are so many. Reina May Nacino, who is a political prisoner. She's an activist who's been incarcerated. She gave birth in prison to Baby River, and Baby River passed away this year. And Reina only had 6 hours of furlough to put her baby to rest. And so, with all of these different people and communities within this movement that we're in, we want the Philippine Human Rights Act to at least be the start of all of these injustices. We want those to be seen and highlighted. We want the U.S. Duterte regime to end the military relationship altogether, and we want the people who are responsible for all of these different things, we want those to be held accountable. And so that's what we're That's what we're fighting for. We want the terror attacks to stop, and we need to be able to protest the government, the Philippines and the US, because we're also affected by this too. We need this to stop. We need to feel safe, and we need a better system right now. Because like Tabitha was saying, we can't ignore this. And under the current system we're in, especially with COVID, we're not protected. Filipinos, least of all, are not protected. And so that is my soapbox. And thank you so much for having me. I will be available for questions if anyone has any.
Thank you so much, Sophia. I think that anytime that we're talking about, community organizing or supporting our communities, we're also talking about accountability and why during struggles the community continues to have to show up for itself. So thank you for sharing your thoughts. And so now we'll move to our next slide, and we will hear from Art De La Rosa, who is a recent University of Oregon graduate, a member of Malaya Movement Portland, and sits on the local legislative steering committee as well. And let's hit play and hear from Art.
Hello, my name is Art De La Rosa, and as a Filipino American, I find it important to bring to the US government's attention the human rights violations that are happening in the Philippines. I think that by passing the Philippines Human Rights Act, it will be the first step in holding the Philippine government responsible for their actions. It may seem hard living in the US to enact change in the Philippines, but by helping to pass the PHRA, it will have a direct impact on the lives of fellow Filipinos. And it being October and Philippine American Heritage Month, it's more important now, more than ever, to bring awareness to this issue by going to the Philippine Human Rights Act website. You can sign the petition and share it with your family and friends and help bring to light the human rights violations that are happening in the Philippines now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Art. And for those that are interested in learning more and referencing the link that Art and Sophia mentioned, you can see that dropped in the chat. And also you can click on tinyurl.com/PHRA petition. And so with that, we'll move to our next slide and our final speaker from the Legislative Steering Committee, Justin Lowe. Justin Lowe, pronouns he, him, is a Filipino and Chinese American who was born and raised in Oregon. He graduated from the University of Portland with a degree in political science and psychology and was a member of PHRA sa UP, and served as the Secretary General of Northwest PHRA. In addition to his work with the Kabataan Alliance as a volunteer staffer in Portland, he currently works as a political consultant for local and state elected officials and as a criminal defense paralegal. He is committed to pushing through the PHRA, advancing criminal justice reform, and elevating student and youth voices in politics and policymaking. Justin, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and good evening. Thank you, Veronica, for that way too long of an introduction that I gave you in the bio. As Veronica mentioned, my name is Justin Lowe. I am a volunteer staffer for the Kabataan Alliance here in Portland, and specifically on legislative advocacy and organizing. I started my community organizing around the Philippines and Filipino identity at the University of Portland when I was a part of PHRA sa UP there, and have continued since then in combination with a lot of my local and state political work. But specifically with the Kabataan Alliance, it is a national alliance of Filipino youth and student organizations that is dedicated to serving our communities both here in the United States and back home in the Philippines. Three of the main pillars that we sort of organize our membership around are to educate about our people's culture and history, as is the theme of tonight's event and has been for this month. Uniting through building connections and coalitions with other student and youth organizations, as well as the ones that you've heard about here today. And lastly, taking action in advancing the rights and the welfare of Filipinos and the Philippines through campaigns and projects, which actually brings us to our support and conversation around the Philippine Human Rights Act. The PHRA is very important for multiple reasons that you've already heard of. And there are two reasons that I'd like to share with you all tonight, one being my own personal thoughts and opinions on it, and then as well as why it is so important to the Kabataan Alliance's work. For me, as someone who had their mother leave the Philippines during the Marcos regime to come here to the United States, because of human rights violations and because of wanting to seek a better life for herself and her family. I see this as a strong and tangible step in holding the Philippine government accountable to these human rights violations, and also it being a very necessary step in keeping the United States accountable in terms of where it spends its money. And to be quite honest, our money, our tax dollars that goes to funding these policing and militaristic actions that are harming our family members, relatives back home, and is suppressing the concepts of freedom of speech and freedom of expression that we so highly value here. And so that is my little backstory as to why I feel so passionate about supporting the PHRA. But then from the Kabataan Alliance perspective, because we work with students and youth, and we're working on elevating and uplifting their voices and their leadership and their futures, it is so incredibly important that they are able to assemble, to express themselves, to stand up for their future and their rights. A lot of you, I'm sure you've seen throughout this year with the civil rights movements happening around the killings of George Floyd and all the other issues that we have seen here in the States this year. A lot of them have been led by youth and students. And it is through word of mouth, through organizing on social media, through campaigning, through speeches, through emails and letters. And the fact that this new anti-terror law prohibits anything of that sort that could, quote unquote, incite someone to commit terrorism is unacceptable. And not only is it unacceptable, it is a denial of the fundamental human rights that all of us should be able to enjoy, both here in the United States and in the Philippines. And since youth and students are at the forefront of that, and they are fighting for the future Philippines that they will be living in, it is integral to the Kabataan Alliance to be in support of the PHRA and their efforts. And so for all of you, if you could check out that link that has been dropped and mentioned already, and share that with your family, friends, and organizations, that would be wonderful in terms of our efforts. And from our side of things, the Kabataan Alliance here in Portland has been working with the university organizations, as well as some of the other youth and working organizations here in Portland and across Oregon, and in alliance with some of our neighbors in Washington and Seattle, to ensure that our students and youth know how to contact their congresspeople and have the knowledge and tools to be able to speak about the PHRA, and then let their congresspeople know why they should be supporting this bill in the United States Congress. And so thank you very much for allowing me to share my story and the work that we are doing with the PHRA at the Kabataan Alliance.
Thank you so much, Justin, for sharing your own personal reasons for supporting the PHRA, but also for talking about the Kabataan Alliance. I know that we've made several references to the Kabataan Alliance throughout this webinar series, and so it only seems right to officially hear more about the Alliance and what you all are doing. Especially as youth and students, really organizing for a better future. And so, so with that, we have learned a little bit more about what is the Malaya movement and what are the local efforts here in Portland related to legislation that's being passed that is specifically looking at the human rights situation in the Philippines and how our role as Filipino Americans contribute to that through our tax dollars, and wanting to be more involved in how we shape the world we live into